Hello and welcome to First and Last Podcast. I'm Michelle.
And I'm Sitara, your host for an exciting journey into the world of real estate rentals. Each episode, we dive into everything you need to know about renting, offering top tips for both renters and landlords. We also have amazing conversations with special guests from all aspects of the rental world, keeping you informed and entertained.
So join us for a practical and engaging journey into residential leasing. Gain valuable insights, expert advice, lots of laughs as we share our experiences and funny stories. Welcome to First and Last Podcast, where renting becomes a breeze. Let's get started. Hi, everyone. Today we have Sitara and myself, Michelle, and we're diving into a hot topic today. It's the top 3 violations caused by renters, so don't be a violator.
Knowing your lease and tenant guidelines is crucial. So let's spill the tea, Michelle. What is number one?
Let's do it. All right. So starting with number 1 on the list. This is a big one, non-payment of rent or late payments. So first off, before we get into why it's, obviously bad not to pay your rent or to be late on your rental payments, I think it's important, Sitara, that first that landlords recognize and understand why tenants may struggle with paying their rent on time or at all. So I think that's a really important thing to note. So getting into some of the main reasons, obviously financial instability, as we all know. It could be maybe you as the tenant became unemployed recently, you had some kind of loss of income, maybe a medical expense that was unexpected, or an emergency unforeseen circumstance. 100% understandable, not a reason to not pay rent, but that is a factor that landlords need to understand. Another one could be lack of communication, right? Like, imagine, Sitara, you lost your job. It's kind of embarrassing. It could be embarrassing to notify your landlord, like, oh, I'm going to be late this month. Or it's a lot of stress and burden on the individual, and especially if they have a family. That's definitely lack of communication could be another factor.
Yeah, you actually reminded me, excuse me, of a time where tenant actually had this for multi-resident where they had auto payments for rent, and they actually switched bank accounts. But
Ooh.
they, for some reason, whatever happened, there was like kind of the letter or whatever. They were a little bit older tenants. Letter got missing. It went through the whole process and they got the notice. So you're right. Lack of communication doesn't necessarily
Right.
mean one person or the other person's at fault. Maybe it was like a collaborate kind of, together. Both people are at fault, and it's always good to kind of get that communication open to talk to people, especially tenants that maybe they're really great tenants for 10 years, and all of a sudden they stop paying rent. Give them a call and be like, "Hey, what's up? What's wrong?"
Yeah,
And I think
exactly. Keeping that communication open is important.
definitely. And definitely disputes and maintenance issues. There's so many times where there's maintenance problems, and then tenants are like, I'm not paying rent because one of the burners on my stove is broken. It's been broken for a week and I'm tired. I'm
Yeah,
not paying rent. And that really, unfortunately, there's no legal recourse when it comes to the tenant getting the landlord to act faster, because withholding your rent is actually a bigger problem at the end of the day.
that's right. Right. And it's understandable. It's frustrating when things break down,
Sure.
but everything breaks down. Everything requires maintenance. Have a little bit of patience. That's not a reason to withhold your rent. You have to understand too, the landlord has bills to pay to keep that house afloat.
Hmm.
So, let's not cause more problems for each other at the end of the day. Lastly, these is all great points, though, disputes and maintenance issues. Another thing that landlords, I think, need to consider is housing affordability. I'm not sure about it where everyone's living. I'm in Toronto, you're in Hong Kong. The rents are ridiculous here, and they continue to rise every single month, let alone your rent increase. Okay. So landlords just be a little bit understanding too that sometimes with these rising rental prices that tenants may struggle. Okay, so especially some of our tenants who may be on a fixed income, right? So again, not a reason for them not to pay rent, but have some understanding of the situation. Okay, so we just want to bring that to your guys' attention. But even with all of these reasons why potentially a landlord may withhold their rent, do not do that as a tenant. So even if something breaks or you suspect your landlord of being shady for whatever reason, if there's a maintenance issue or repairs, pay your rent on time, pay it in full. It's super crucial to avoid eviction, and keep that communication open. If you know you're not going to be able to make that payment next month, call your landlord, discuss it. Are there other options too, Sitara? Let's say a tenant is struggling, right? And they know in advance what's an option for them that can
Yeah.
help them pay that rent more comfortably.
And I think just going back to your point on communication, if you
Yeah.
know there's something gonna happen, you're gonna have a hard time paying rent, a lot of them times you can actually speak to your landlord and get a payment plan. Maybe there's
Great
a
idea.
way that you can pay every 2 months to kind of catch up to, your missed payment, whatever the case is. Sometimes you can do missed payment plans. And it's always best, of course, to begin before you end up in like, the legal part of
Right.
eviction process. And I know, Michelle, you know, this is a pretty lengthy process. So what is it that happens when you don't pay rent? Like, what are we looking at after?
Right. So what happens is, so first of all, the in Ontario, the Landlord Tenant Board provides guidelines and regulations to address
Mhm.
non-payment of rent. Okay. So there's some points to consider if you're a tenant and you don't pay your rent on time or in full. Your landlord has the right to serve you what's called an N4 notice for non-payment or late payment of rent. And it's a notice to end the tenancy early. It's kind of a scary notice saying you are late,
Mhm.
and if you don't pay the rent by within 14 days and they'll give you the date, you will be evicted or they will start the process. It's a scary notice to get, right? So they can serve you that. You have 14 days to rectify the problem. And if you don't, next step is the landlord can now file an application to have you evicted.
Mm.
Okay. And you don't want to go through that. That's a long drawn process, right? And then let's say it gets to that hearing at the Landlord Tenant Board in Ontario, of course. If the Landlord Tenant Board determines that you're guilty or you are in breach of some sort, now they can start that eviction process to remove you. So those are some things that you need to consider, and that's regardless if, again, if the landlord didn't fix your stove right away. You
Mhm.
know, um, there are ways, just side note, I'm not saying that the landlord's right, or wrong for not fixing your appliance or replacing it. There are other methods and forms and that you can file with the landlord tenant board
Yeah.
against the landlord, but
Mhm.
you cannot withhold rent for these reasons.
Mhm.
Okay. So just really important things to consider. Um, Now, the tenant who fails to pay their rent, even after landlord tenant board says you're in breach, you do need to pay the rent. They may face several consequences if you don't. Um, Sitar, can you talk about some of those consequences?
Yeah.
I'm sure you've experienced this before working in multifamily.
Yeah. Um, they're looking at eviction. You can basically you have to vacate the premises between a specific time frame. And the
Hmm.
landlord can then also involve law enforcement. And a lot of times it's in the form of a sheriff that they schedule a time. And usually some landlords, and this is not all, but some of them
Hmm.
are pretty lenient that if you can pay that rent up until then, they will actually cancel the eviction. But again, it depends on that communication that you've had with that landlord that they know maybe, you had like a death in the family or something happened, whatever emergency it was, and you've been that open line of communication. Maybe they're more willing
Yeah.
to be like, okay, do the payment plan, we'll cancel the eviction. But then you have like rental history, non-payment of rent, you can be on the rental history. And then the other thing is like you need landlord references. That's not gonna happen anymore if failure to pay rent. And then you got
Mm.
legal costs where you might be responsible for the landlord's legal costs during the LTB process. And then some landlords may be collection agencies. They might, forward your late payment or non-payment unpaid rent to a collection agency, and then that will affect your credit score. and then you're going to have issues in the future.
Absolutely. And that's issues whether renting or taking out a mortgage. Let's say you want
Mhm.
to buy a house down the road, that negative mark on your credit report could affect you because of one little non-payment. So yeah, really, really important to understand the consequences.
Yeah, and
All right, let's move into number two, violations. What do
yeah,
we have on the list here, Sitara?
and I think the next one's damaging the property, and I feel like such a scary topic. Damage, and it's like you can think
Oh,
about pretty much from anything, from a dog ripping out a baseboard to like a hole being punched into the wall. There's a lot of
we've seen it all.
responsibilities. Yeah,
Yeah,
there's a lot
yeah.
of responsibilities for the landlord when it comes to rental properties, and I think that's like repair and maintenance. You're talking about keeping the electrical, the plumbing, appliances in the common areas, you know, walls, roof, windows, doors, everything in a working and good condition. Then you have cleanliness, maintaining the common areas such as lobbies, halls, elevators,
Mhm,
laundry rooms, and such like that. Then you have also like property standards. You need to meet health and safety. Going back to episode 2, just like the snow on the outside and the ice, you don't want to slip and fall in your flip flops. Housing, maintenance standards set by, bylaws and regulations. And then, of course, fire safety, which is huge. You got to comply with fire safety laws for rental
abs
properties. And then you have vital services, so water, electricity, gas, heating, and that's regardless
mhm.
of rental payment or property damage. This is something landlord must provide. Don't think, I mean, it's kind of like, what if this was your house and you don't have water? You can't
Yeah,
survive. Like, you need to have that's like vital. And then notice for entry, landlords must provide tenants 24-hour notice in advance when entering for their unit for inspections, repairs, or replacements. And that includes emergency as well.
mhm. These are really good points, to understand what a landlord's responsibilities are in general when maintaining a property for a
Mhm.
tenant. Those are their responsibilities, some of them. Going into tenant responsibilities, though, what is your responsibility as a tenant? Well, it's pretty simple. Keep your unit clean to a reasonable standard,
Mhm.
right? Like
Yeah.
you don't want to live in a dirty home, whether you own it or not. No one wants to live in a dirty home. Your responsibility is keep it clean. And especially if there's other people living at the property with you,
Yes.
or it's a
100%.
multi-family building, it's a huge problem when you don't keep your place clean because, for example, it could introduce certain pest control issues,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
And that's going to interfere with the landlord or other people's enjoyment of the property. Your other responsibility is to repair or pay for any damages caused by yourself or your guests, excluding normal wear and tear. Um, Give me some examples, Sitara. Like, what's normal wear and tear, and then what's something like you could potentially be charged for damages?
So one comes to mind. Like regular wear and tears, like maybe the walls need to be touched up. The walls are white and it needs to be touched up. I've had a couple actually funny story. One person painted the inside of their unit chalk black, like
Oh, I think I saw
like
that unit. Yeah,
like
yeah. They're
all walls, everything pitch black.
black.
And a lot of times it's kind of like common, you got to paint it back to what the landlord initially had.
Yeah,
Some type
yeah.
of white doesn't have to be the exact same color, white, cream, ivory, whatever you want to call it. Can't leave the unit.
Neutral white.
You can't leave the
Yeah.
unit pitch black because there's no way the next person's gonna like it,
No,
right? And then
absolutely. Actually, you reminded me. Sorry, I have another funny. Speaking of black walls, I had a tenant. This was a property in Florida. They vacated. First of all, they were not paying rent. Lots of drama there.
mm,
But they painted the walls not only black, but at the top of each door frame, they had cat eyes. So it's like there was eyes looking at you throughout the unit. I don't know. They were some kind of tenants into some who knows? Will seem very Halloween witchy kind of,
oh my god,
decoration on the wall.
cat eyes.
Um, but yeah, you're right. So that is not normal wear and tear. That
No,
is
that
definitely,
isn't. Yeah, and
uh,
I'm thinking
personal
back
preference.
to when tenant had a dog. and the dog ripped up all the baseboards of
Oh yeah.
the unit, and, like, there's no arguing. That is not regular wear and tear
Where?
where all the molding, not even all the baseboards, and then the door frames, everything needed to be
Yeah,
replaced because the dog. And
completely.
I'm legit it was like a great date. Like, so I mean, like, the thing really
Well,
did damage to the walls. That is not regular wear and tear. No.
right. No, that's a good point. So also another responsibility for the tenant is we were talking about taking responsibility for damages from their tenant, their guests, or their pets,
Mhm.
or failure to address damage or willfully causing harm could also lead to eviction as well. Okay. And do not use the rental property for non residential purposes that
Yeah.
could cause significant damage. So if a property is deemed residential, well, it's just residential. It's just for
Yeah.
you living. You shouldn't be operating, I don't know, a mechanic shop on the driveway, for example. God forbid something happened,
Mhm.
you're changing the oil and the car falls, God forbid, and someone gets hurt, you're operating a business. So that's something to consider as a responsibility for a tenant. That being said, if you or someone in your home has caused intentional or accidental damage to the rental unit or the building, um, and you could be served what's called an N5 notice, which means you have 7 days to fix the problem or pay for the problem. Else, the landlord can file for eviction. If you do resolve this issue within 7 days with the landlord tenant board, again, this is specifically for Ontario. Check your guidelines within your city. But if you do rectify the problem or you come to an agreement with the landlord of paying for damages, the landlord can cancel the order to evict you. Okay. Number three, moving into the last uh, violation here for tenants. Big one, disturbance complaints. So first we talked about non-payment of rent. Second was damages to the property. Third is disturbances, and there's many examples of disturbances. It's not just, for example, noise. It could be, playing loud, having loud parties like till
Yeah.
5 in the morning, which technically is loud music and noise, right? But another example would be leaving garbage in the hallway or in the home and it's stinking up the place, and especially if you're in an apartment building and you think it's okay to just put the garbage in the hallway. Well, it's not actually, depending on how stinky the garbage is. But it's a fire issue, one, but two, it's just not a good thing to do and you should not be doing it legally. Another disturbance could be throwing cigarette butts off the balcony. This is a big one. No, like, first of all, smoking should not be allowed in most buildings, and it's not unless it's grandfathered, whole other story.
Mhm.
Nonetheless, be a responsible tenant. Okay, so throwing butts off the balcony, could lead to a disturbance complaint, and most importantly, harassing or threatening your landlord and or other tenants or people at the property. Okay,
Mhm.
this could even be service technicians, maintenance guys,
Yeah.
whoever it may be. You
Mhm.
can't be harassing or threatening anyone because that could lead to a potential eviction.
Yeah. Uh,
So, um,
I just
yeah,
thought
you
of
had a
a
point.
really funny story.
Sure.
Garbage in the hallway. I remember one time had a tenant call and they were like livid. And I was like, what is the problem? They left their shoes outside in the hallway
Oh
in a
gosh,
garbage bag. And then the the
just a
main
pair of shoes
just
in a garbage bag.
the cleaner of maintenance cleaner of the building was like, garbage bag outside the unit. Assumption was it's garbage. They threw the shoes out. And then,
No.
but like in that type of situation, it's like, why would you leave? It wasn't just like shoes outside. Why would you leave your shoes in actual garbage bags
Yeah.
outside?
Yeah.
And it was just the only one bag. It's not like they were moving or anything. And I remember them getting so angry for that. I was like, we have a pretty strict no garbage outside on the hallway, and because people actually truly leave garbage and then you get pest control and that whole problem. But I just remember they were so angry and they're like, somebody stole my shoes. And then I was like, did you leave it out? We're like, what do you mean someone stole your shoes? And they're like, I had it in a garbage bag. I was like, uh It's garbage.
That is hilarious. Yeah. So again, a couple of reasons not to leave stuff in the hallway
Yes.
is
Yes.
even if it's not garbage, it may be deemed as garbage and thrown out. So just don't leave stuff in the hallway. But a couple things to know, really, really good points, Tara. But it's important to know that if you do cause some kind of disturbance, whether it's like garbage in the hallway or noise or whatever it may be, it could be innocent. It could have been a one time, a one off, sure. The landlord, either way, if they're upset about it or someone's complaining, they have to give you written notice of the
Mm,
disturbance. That's
okay.
really important to know. They can't just call you and say, hey, I'm going to
Yeah.
evict you. It has to be formally by written notice to notify you of the disturbance and when it happened. And the form will explain all of that. You have 7 days to correct that problem. So, how
Mhm.
do you correct the problem? Stop doing the problem. Whatever the disturbance is
Oh,
that's written on
yes.
the notice, stop it. Just stop it. And do that within 7 days. Now, let's
Mm.
say you don't. Let's say you got this notice and you're like, I don't care. I'm going to throw a wicked party in like 3 months. It's my birthday or whatever. And you throw another party that's expensive and disturbing everyone. And that's, you receive a second notice now from the landlord within 6 months. Two times you had the same violation within 6 months. If you do that, and you didn't rectify the problem or anything like that, now the landlord has the right to go to the landlord tenant board to serve or file for an eviction. Okay, so try to comply and follow the rules, especially when you're living in a multifamily property where
Mhm.
there's other tenants. Be wary of that. It's not just you. You don't own the unit. You don't own the building. You all have to live there and get along at the end of the day. And it's just important to know like what what the rules are, right? Or you could be evicted. So yeah, so before the hearing, you can take steps to prevent the eviction. You can negotiate with your landlord. Again, this is going back to that open communication.
Yeah.
Speak to them because you may be able to resolve things outside of going through this long, drawn out process with the landlord tenant board. Okay.
Yeah.
So those are our top three.
Yeah. Going back, actually, one point, Michelle, that you had noise disturbance. We're talking about, like we said, music. We're talking about partying. We're
Yeah.
not talking about, the family that lives upstairs that got two young kids and the kids are running around and they're living life. We're talking about truly when it comes to, um, I think like more like negligent things that they're truly making it difficult for you. Not the regular day to day noise that you get when it comes to
Mhm.
multi-residential living or house like basement and top floor.
Yeah.
Sometimes older buildings, you're gonna hear so much more noise. You're gonna hear the creaking and everything. I feel like there has to be some type of caution for people when they're renting to kind of keep in mind your your comfortability when it comes to noise and how susceptible you are when it comes to disturbances like that. If you're living in a multi-residential, gotta keep in mind like people are gonna be a little bit noisy. Maybe your unit is closer to like a main floor entrance, like things like that.
Right. Or
You
the
can't
elevator or
Yeah, you
the
can't
garbage chute. There's going to be noises.
you can't
Hmm.
complain about things that cannot be, you know, changed. Those are
Change.
things, yeah,
Yeah.
you can't change, this door
Mhm.
is too noisy, please close off this door, have people enter another location. It's not possible.
Right.
But
You gotta know what makes you tick as a tenant before
yeah,
you pick. It's not gonna be 100% perfect ever,
mhm,
but if you know that you need quiet, maybe you wanna be on the top floor of
exactly.
an apartment building. You don't wanna be in the basement, you don't wanna be on a lower floor,
Mhm.
right? So, yeah, really good points. Actually, you reminded me, of something too about, sorry, what was that topic you were just saying again?
The
Yes, about
noise building.
noise and different
Yeah.
levels that were. So I used to live, fun fact, I used to live in a basement. This was during COVID times. I
Mm,
thought I'm gonna get out of the condo and go live in the suburbs and rent a basement of a house. And at the time, the landlord had not rented the upstairs unit.
mm,
And so I was like, sweet. I move into the basement. Keep in mind, it's an older home. I move into the basement, all is well, nice and quiet. And then the family moves in upstairs. And they had a young child and they also had a small dog.
Mm.
So, and they also were early risers, 5 a.m. Now, I'm not
Oh my god.
a super morning person, totally fine, whatever. But they liked to start their day by, walking the dog, but within the house. Now, just to give you some context, my bedroom was underneath their living room where they tend to congregate. So,
Mm.
6 o'clock in the morning, the son would wake up. He's probably like 6, and he would grab, those Kong toys for the dogs. They're like
Oh, yeah, yeah,
heavy
yeah, yeah.
hard plastic, right? They would throw it in the living room and it would go boom right on top of the floor, which is my
Oh, no.
ceiling where I'm sleeping. And it was like boom. It was like Claymore bombs. I thought I was in war like
Mm.
every morning. So I
Oh my
legit had to
god.
sleep with noise canceling headphones on
Mhm.
because it was, and I don't blame the the boy, of course, the child, they're just playing, but again, there's that communication. So speaking to
Yes.
the tenant upstairs saying, "Hey, listen, do you mind?" Just having that conversation can
Mhm.
avoid so much problems down the road, and landlord, of course, didn't have to get involved,
No.
right? But yeah, just for example.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
actually happened when I was renting too. I used to have those balls where you can put, like, treats in it for the dog, but it's like a hard plastic one. They would roll it and the treat will
Yeah.
fall out, and then it made a lot of noise, but I never really thought much of it until one day, like, my dog was playing with it, and then all of a sudden, I pick it up and I just hear bang, 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 and I was like, "What was that?" And I realized it's the person below was because that probably was so freaking
Yeah.
loud that it annoyed
Yeah.
the hell and, like, think about it, dog's, like, pushing it, pushing it, pushing it, just wants to get all the treats
Hmm.
out, right? Um, m
Yeah.
Good enough that I was, like, quick to learn, I was like, "Hey, I'm not gonna let him play with this here or at this specific time, maybe during the day at a certain time or whatever." Um,
Right.
I still remember, I was like, where is that noise coming from?" And it was underneath
Yeah.
me. It's just I'm assuming the
That
guy had a broom and was like, "Hey," like
That reminds me of a scene of, Friends. Do you
yeah,
remember? The old guy with the broom, and then Monica is like
yeah, yeah,
yeah, yeah,
I didn't do that though, but exactly. I think, like, these are things that tenants definitely need to be aware of, like, communication,
yeah. Mhm.
talking. So it's like, you know, tenants, it's important to be in the know. Like, you really need to understand that you need to be familiarized with the rules. You want to avoid being a violator, right? Like, that's
Yeah,
super
don't
important.
violate.
Don't violate.
And to all you landlords out there, let's just keep this reasonable. Everyone has their reasons for doing things, whether they're right or wrong. But,
Mhm,
if it happens once or twice where a tenant doesn't pay the rent, for example, and they give you a reason, or there is some kind of noise disturbance, get to the bottom of it and consider just making a note of it if it's one or two times and move on, right? Like, we don't want to jump to sending people to court and evicting them. If there's a reason, maybe you can work with them. So, in my opinion, the best solution is to foster a peaceful living community with you and the
mhm.
tenant and have some understanding and work together. I know it's easier said than done, but setting those guidelines and open communication is super important to avoiding any of these notices and whatnot.
Yeah. And if you're looking for help with renting your property, you can reach out to Michelle so she can
And,
recommend a leasing specialist in your area.
and if you need any advice whatsoever regarding marketing, social media, home staging tips, you can speak to our expert here, Sitara, for any help with those needs. So join us for our next episode where we're going to share more valuable tips and practices to improve your experience, whether you're a landlord or a renter. So stay tuned. And for any important resources and our contact information, this will all be linked up below, in the show notes below. So definitely check them out. And thanks for joining us today.
Bye.
Bye bye.
This podcast is for educational purposes only and is not intended to replace professional legal advice. We are not responsible for any losses, damages, or liabilities that may arise from the use of this podcast. The views expressed in this podcast may not be those of the host or the management. This podcast is solely for entertainment purposes. Please consult a licensed professional.